Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom when we take a humanist perspective, logical questions. This week we've been looking at holy animal kingdom, Darwin and casting a wider net. And today I want to look at maybe it's the hippocampus, that is the scramble of scientists to find some difference in the human brain after Darwin's dangerous idea came along. As I mentioned on Tuesday, Christians have long debated the question of whether or not there is a vestigium of God in animals, a vestige, vestigium Dei, which would then make animals holy as humans are considered holy within the Christian tradition. I want to take a little bit of a side path here and look at a poem by Wendell Berry, a contemporary poet, a very famous poem called The Peace of Wild Things. He writes this: when despair of the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound and fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wooded drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Now, this is a very beautiful poem looking at how wild things are not taxed with forethought of grief. They're not worried about what the future is going to hold. They don't have that particular anxiety. Now, this is probably true. But notice how we deal with the difference between human beings and animals as a way to reassure ourselves in some way. And this really looks at the question, and a very old question, of does a human being have something that an animal does not have? Might it be a soul? Might it be consciousness? Might it be self-awareness? Or something about that forethought or imagination that makes us anxious? It's a good question, and we don't really know the answer at the moment. In 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species. This is the book, of course, that changed everything in terms of people who do follow the science of how we understand the world. Famously, in his notebook, Darwin had been doodling along and he wrote, I think, and drew a what we would see as a tree of life, that all things are interconnected all the way back to some kind of single source. And this idea is what gives us the idea of natural selection, but also it's what makes natural selection tell us that animals and human beings are far more connected than we had admitted heretofore. In that book, Darwin wrote, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Now, he says this in The Origin of Species, 1859, but he doesn't talk about the origin of humanity. He talks very scientifically about the findings that he has had, and he avoids talking about humans because Darwin already understood that his theory would put human beings into the same category as all other animals. So, as we say nowadays, non human animals and human animals is the actual split between those things. Now, in 1871, he did publish a book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. He says their ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. That is his reaction to the brouhaha that had been going on since 1859. But this book is really not as well thought out and as beautifully written as the previous one, and it really doesn't get as much reading even today. An intermediary book, what came out in 1863, and this is by Thomas Huxley. Huxley is often called Darwin's bulldog because he took on the critics of natural selection head on and said, wait a minute, this is what this real science is. In 1863, remember 1859, now this is 1863, Huxley publishes Man's Place in Nature. And this is an intermediary step. He's going to be in some way buffering Darwin from the criticism, although actually that didn't work. That book contains the now famous look at how the human animal probably did indeed evolve. This is the first time that we see this particular progression. This was drawn by Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who lived from 1807 to 1904, and it is the frontispiece for Huxley's evidence as to man's place in nature. Well, in that book, Huxley writes this: whatever part of the animal fabric, whatever series of muscles, whatever viscera might be selected for comparison, the result would be the same. The lower apes and the gorilla would differ more than the gorilla and the man. And so here we have it, that there is more variation within a species than there is between. And therefore, human beings are indeed, through muscles and viscera, exactly like animals. Now, this came in for a lot of criticism, obviously. From the church, it's going to happen. But it also happened within the scientific community itself. The British biologist Richard Owen, 1804 to 1892, coined the term dinosaur, and he was a very major biologist in that time period, and indeed had been a friend of Darwin. Here he is with his dinosaur collection. Not a mental lightweight by any comparison. He said this: the powers, aspirations, and mission of man are such as to raise the study of his origin in nature, inevitably and by the very necessity of the case, from the mere physiological to the psychological stage of scientific operations. So we can't just be looking at monkey skeletons if we want to really find out why it is that human beings are so special. And indeed, Richard Owen is being motivated by his deep Christian belief. Charles Darwin later said, "It is painful to be hated in the intense degree with which Richard Owen hates me." They just did not get along after the publication of Origin of Species in 1859. And Huxley was especially cruel to Richard Owen. As a matter of fact, one of the ditties from the time, anonymously written, has this to say. It says, Owen, you can see the brain of chimpanzee is always exceedingly small, with the hindermost horn of extremity shorn, and no hippocampus at all. Well, what is the hippocampus? It is indeed a brain region, and Richard Owen insisted that that had to be the place where human consciousness, the very super special human consciousness, had to be located. But as you see from the ditty, not everybody bought that, and indeed it is not true. Cartoon from the time, Ancestor Worship is the title of this cartoon. It quotes the Jewish scripture, Hosea. Ephraim is joined to idols, let him alone. And indeed, we have the statue here, Darwinian hypothesis of evolution, with a chimpanzee up there, and this bowing, scraping person who is labeled science falsely so-called. So we in the know are not going to be ancestor worshippers of chimpanzees and apes. Another cartoon from the time, Paths of Righteousness is the question for this one. And indeed, we've got a father and son walking through a mud puddle here that is labeled superstition. The fundamentalist, he has this on his hat, the dad, with his sign, down with education, to hell with the truth. And poor little younger generation, his kids saying, Papa, must we wade around in this mud all our lives? Well, the answer is indeed yes, if you're going to keep your fundamentalist faith. And that is a little cartoon from the time. It kind of shows exactly where people were getting on these battle lines that were being drawn. Darwin writes, intelligence is based on how efficient a species became at doing the things they need to survive. So, in other words, human beings are as we are because that's what it takes for human beings to survive. However, the dog by the fireplace has already as much intelligence as it needs because it's by a fireplace that it didn't have to work for. And so, who is the intelligent one, as pet owners will often ask? Darwin also wrote, animals whom we have made our slaves, we do not like to consider our equal. But indeed, Darwin knew that his dangerous idea led to the conclusion that human beings and animals are all webbed together in this massive spider web that is reality itself. And our consciousness is only a different sort of consciousness, but in no way different from animals. And indeed, Darwin could not have known that we would later discover that the structure of DNA is out there. All living things have DNA. Now we know, and we do indeed know that 98% of our genetic material is like that of the chimpanzee. Now, 98% is not 100%, and there are differences, but differences are pretty small when you look at the all of the DNA. And so that branching tree that Darwin drew long ago, I think was indeed true. He just didn't know how true it was, and he never was able to live long enough to see DNA. Next week, we'll be talking about And the Beasts of the Field. I want to talk about how human beings have dealt historically with animals within scriptures and how they have been used as metaphors by human beings over time. Thanks for listening this week. We do have a live session on Fridays at 9 a.m. Central Time. If you would like that Zoom link, just email me, minister@firstunitarian.org. Thank you so much for listening this week, a little bit about animals, and we'll be back next week. Thanks so much for listening.